The small town of High Pines in Montana was the kind of place where life flowed slowly and peacefully. There were no factories or big cities that consumed people's lives, but that's why its residents valued the tranquility they could find in their hometown. They preferred not to deal with the noise and bustle of the world, not worrying about the latest trends, but simply enjoying the quiet simplicity of life. Winter in High Pines was long and snowy, but there was a charm to it. The locals had grown accustomed to the cold and snowstorms, often retreating into their cozy homes by the fire, enjoying warmth and comfort. For a group of old friends, reuniting on this winter evening, New Year's was a chance to recapture the magical moments that once bound them together, back when they were young and carefree. Pam, the owner of an old house on the outskirts of High Pines, invited her sister Molly, who had moved to Seattle years ago and hadn't been back in the town for a while, along with their school friend Rachel and their colleague Amy, who had recently moved to High Pines. Pam's house was an old wooden building with large windows through which one could see the snow-covered forest. It stood at the edge of the woods, away from the town's lights. The house was more than just a building. It was a story in itself. Pam had grown up there, and now she invited her friends to relive the past, to experience the same joy and carefree moments they had shared when they were younger. The evening began with warm conversations, champagne glasses, and anecdotes. Pam suggested they play a game, one they used to play when they were still in school. The atmosphere was relaxed, fun. Molly talked about her life in Seattle, her new friends and experiences. Rachel reminisced about the old times when they all used to walk these streets, and joked about how much things had changed. Even Amy, who was usually more reserved, gradually got into the spirit of things. She laughed, drank wine, and recalled the time when she first met Rachel and Pam at university. Everything felt just like old times: laughter, wine, and memories. As the evening progressed, the mood became more elevated. After several glasses of champagne, the conversations became more candid, the jokes louder, and the laughter more infectious. Everyone was relaxed, tipsy, and happy, as if they were reliving their youth. "Let's go outside and watch the fireworks," Rachel suggested. She opened the door, and as soon as the cold air rushed into the room, they all gasped at the frosty freshness. But after a few minutes in the cold, they returned inside, feeling their cheeks and noses turn red from the chill. Pam shut the door, and they sat back down around the fire, savoring the comfort. The atmosphere in the house remained easygoing, but something, or someone, was drawing closer. The sounds outside had become strange. When Pam noticed that the sounds had grown louder, and the noise now vaguely resembled the scraping of heavy paws on snow, she stood up and approached the window. Looking out through the glass, she could only see dark silhouettes of trees bending under the force of the wind. The outside world was covered in a white blanket, and there seemed to be no threat. "Probably just a boar or a deer," Rachel said, trying to reassure everyone. But in Pam's eyes, there was a flicker of confusion. The sounds didn't stop. They were growing louder, more unnerving, as if something truly enormous was approaching the house. "This is strange," she muttered quietly, stepping away from the window, feeling an increasing sense of unease. "There's something out there." Rachel tried to joke, but her voice sounded nervous. Suddenly there was a loud crack. Pam quickly jumped to the door and managed to hear a sound like a hard hit. Her heart pounded, and she hurried to the window again, trying to see what was happening outside. And then she saw it. A grizzly bear, huge, powerful, was moving closer to the house, seemingly drawn by the warmth and scents coming from inside. Its eyes glowed in the darkness as it sniffed the air. Pam froze, unable to believe her eyes. The bear was too close.
"Close the windows! Run to the other side of the house!" she screamed, but it was already too late. The bear was too close.
Pam immediately rushed to the door, trying to lock it, but at that moment, a loud bang shook the entire house. The grizzly forced its way into the house. First, it shook the door. Then, with great force, it broke through the wood, shattering the wooden planks and breaking the protective grills. In seconds, the bear was inside, its eyes filled with rage, and its massive paws tore through the furniture. Pam screamed, trying to find somewhere to hide. Amy and Rachel rushed to the windows, attempting to escape, but the bear was already too close. It tore through all barriers with terrifying speed, its claws shaking the very walls of the house. Molly, who was closest to the door, tried to escape, but the bear grabbed her instantly, lifting her off the ground. She struggled, but the bear's sharp claws sank into her shoulder, and with a horrifying scream, she was tossed aside. Rachel and Amy ran frantically through the house, desperately trying to hide. Amy grabbed a knife, but before she could do anything, the bear grabbed her, throwing her to the floor. She couldn't even scream. Pam stood frozen, horrified, watching the nightmare unfold. She tried to think of a way to survive, but couldn't gather her thoughts. Only when her eyes met the bear's did she realize that she needed to act quickly. Panic was overwhelming, but in that moment, she knew that hesitation would mean certain death. Pam, overcoming her fear, ran toward the back exit, hoping to find safety. She looked back, glancing at the house that had become a scene of chaos and destruction. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the doorway. Dan, Amy's husband. He had heard the screams and strange noises from outside. Upon seeing the unusual signs, he rushed toward the house. Grabbing his weapon, Dan entered the house. He knew there was little chance of survival, but he was prepared to fight until the end. He aimed and shot at the bear. The grizzly roared in pain, but didn't retreat. It was angrier now, its fury intensifying, but Dan continued firing, hitting the beast. With each shot, the bear grew more aggressive, but it was clear it was losing strength. At the final moment, Dan shot directly into its chest, and the bear, roaring, finally collapsed. Silence hung in the air. Pam, exhausted and delirious from the trauma, couldn't comprehend what had just happened. It felt like a nightmare. She was the only one left. Her friends, Rachel, Amy, and Molly, were gone. Dan helped her out of the house. Their eyes met, and Pam understood that she was the only survivor. The bear was dead, but it had left a permanent scar in their hearts. The police arrived an hour later. They found the bodies of Pam's friends, their eyes wide with shock and terror. The house had been destroyed. The entire town of High Pines was shaken. The story of the bear attack quickly spread across the news. It was a tragedy that no one could have ever expected in their peaceful town. For Pam, life would never be the same. She had lost her closest friends, and now her only task was to find a way to move forward. The fireworks that had once brought joy seemed like a distant memory now. Despite the grizzly's death, the consequences of that night were far-reaching. High Pines was a small town, and the tragedy had shaken it to its core. Many people couldn't believe that such a thing could happen in their peaceful little town. However, it was this isolation that may have been the reason the bear had come so close. The town was in shock, and the police, rescue teams, and wildlife experts tried to figure out how the grizzly had ended up so near the town. Some believed the bear might have been alone, and that the attack was part of a wider pattern of wild animals moving closer to human settlements due to expanding development. Months passed before Pam realized that her life would never be the same. She decided to leave High Pines and move to Seattle with her sister, but something inside her resisted. She couldn't let go of the memories of that place, of the house that was now destroyed. She decided to return to bury her friends where they had once laughed and lived. Dan stayed in High Pines, knowing that the town would change after this tragedy. He was one of the few who chose to remain, supporting Pam through the difficult moments. He continued to work in the town, helping the police with wildlife control, but he too could not forget the horrors they had experienced. Months after the attack, life in High Pines still hadn't returned to normal. People started to feel unsafe. Many tried to understand how such a powerful and dangerous bear had ended up so close to their homes. Experts concluded that the grizzly was likely a wild animal forced to search for food due to an especially harsh winter. For Pam, who had survived the attack, it was a life lesson. She learned to appreciate every moment, every morning, yet the memory of what happened that night never left her. She often woke up in the middle of the night, trying to understand why it had happened, why her friends had died while she survived. Dan tried to comfort her, but he knew that no words could bring back what had been lost. He continued working in town, helping the local police to prevent further incidents, but he couldn't forget what they had been through either. High Pines, while still on the map, was no longer the same peaceful town it once was. The memory of that terrifying night lingered in the minds of every resident. Fear had seeped deep into the town, never to leave. Many began to leave High Pines, realizing that there was no longer any safety from the wilderness they had once taken for granted. Pam only returned to a normal life a year later, when she moved to Seattle. But even there, she could not shake the feeling of guilt. She began writing a blog, sharing her story, hoping that it would help others understand the importance of respecting nature and the dangers that could come if we ignored them. She shared her experience with others, trying to find peace within herself, though she knew that the shadow of that night would never disappear. Every time she saw a bear, or when she told her story to someone else, her heart would ache. But perhaps it was this pain that helped her move forward. The story of her friends, the tragedy, and the lessons she had learned became a part of her life, and she began to understand that even the most terrible events could be turned into a source of strength. High Pines would never forget that night. It was an event that left a scar in the town's history. But for Pam, it was a lesson that even in the quietest and safest places, one could encounter unexpected dangers, and that it's important to appreciate every moment of life.